Welcome back to Hard to Be Human. I'm your host, Chad Rogers. The title of this podcast is Hard to Harmonize. And by way of introduction, let me just say that in this podcast, we're going to be talking about what we all attempt to do every day of our lives. We try to harmonize ourselves, we try to harmonize our lives with the lives of others. And part of the reason that it's so hard for humans to harmonize with themselves and with others is that we are very complex creatures. That's to say that there are a lot of moving parts. What that means is that we have a lot of contributing factors. There are a lot of alternatives, there are a lot of options and choices that we can make in different circumstances. And that's bad enough, or I should say, probably that's difficult enough, meaning that having all the decisions with all the different options or all the combinations of options available makes it very challenging to harmonize the different pieces of ourselves with the other pieces. But it gets worse because sometimes the things that we want or the beliefs or ideals that we have, sometimes those things conflict with each other. And still worse even than that, sometimes we know what we want or what we want to do, but we don't behave accordingly. Sometimes we knowingly act against our own desires and against our own best interest, and that's called self-sabotage. More about that a little bit later on. So in this episode, we will be addressing the question of why are there so many options? Why are there so many combinations and pieces that we have to sort through in order to try and harmonize ourselves with ourselves? Where do the pieces come from? How do they work? So why are we like this, and why is it so hard for us to harmonize ourselves with ourselves? And there are several different contributing factors, but we really have to start with the foundation of our thinking and decision making, and that's really just called a worldview. So what is a worldview? Really, the simplest way to define worldview is it's the way that you view the world, but that's kind of a tautology. It doesn't really help us in a sense because you've just said what you were trying to explain. So put simply and hopefully kind of usefully in this case, a worldview is your complete and your comprehensive understanding of the world and how it works. And there are dozens and dozens of writers who have given different definitions of worldviews. And rather than try to give you all the different definitions or even just try to give you the quotes, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some key words that many of them use. And so here are just kind of a list of words that can hopefully help convey just what a worldview is. And so here are the words like it's a filter, a framework, a lens, it's glasses, it's a theory, it's a life system, a map and compass, ruling ideas, presuppositions, and assumptions. So your worldview is an analysis or a synthesis of all the experiences that you have had or experiences that you have not had. And when you put those things together in your mind, they combine with what you're taught by the different influencers in your life. And the influencers are people like your parents, teachers, friends, the media that you consume. They're those types of things. So when you combine your experiences and what you've been taught by others, your worldview is the filter that organizes and makes sense out of all of those things. So for now, also, let me just note, your personal experiences are what are called internal influences, and then the other influencers that you have in your life are external. So the things that come from within versus the things that come from without. Just so you know, I'll be talking about that a little bit later on as well. Now, all of those beliefs, all of those ideas and experiences, all those influences and influencers, they all mix together, and the products that come out of all of those things when they're combined is your worldview. And so as you continue through life, you will add more and more experiences, you're going to add more knowledge, you're going to add new influencers, your worldview will shift, it will change, and it will do that in large ways and in very subtle ways as well. So your very complex brain takes all of these things and it builds your worldview. It takes them and it constructs a lens for you to look at the world through that will allow you to successfully navigate the world as you understand it. Now, this involves simple things like getting ready for your day, meaning things like just personal hygiene, but it also means complex things like dealing with relationships, whether that means family, friends, work relationships, or even drivers on the road or people that you meet when you're shopping in a store. It's going to help manage all of the different relationships that you're going to run into on a day-to-day basis. So in a way, your brain does all of this without thinking. It's probably better to say that it has practiced creating this lens or this filter since you were born, and now it runs through that process of filtering all these different experiences. It does that in the background without you really consciously thinking about it. You're just going about your day, but your brain's filtering out all these different experiences. Now, there's a lot of construction that goes on when you're younger with your worldview, and then that construction gets less as you age, and your brain relies on the training that it had when you were younger, and it functions accordingly. So the older you get, the harder it is to change your worldview. So sometimes we talk about someone who might be stuck in their ways, and what we really just mean is that their brain has operated under this worldview for so long, it becomes very difficult for them to change their mind. So there is something called ideological immunity, and basically all that phrase means is that the more you know about a particular thing, the harder it is for you to change your mind with regard to that topic. And that's what that idea of just being set in your ways. Now we're going to talk more about ideological immunity in a future podcast, but again, just so it's in your mind, and for here and now, understanding really that the younger you are, the more pliable your brain is, and the older you get, the more rigid your brain gets, because you've made all of those neurological connections, and since you've made those connections, your brain tends to think in that easier path, which is just to say it tends to think the way that you've always thought. Now, I like to compare our worldview to a frame of a house. And so your worldview is this kind of mental frame because your worldview is composed primarily of your most foundational thoughts about the world. So it supports the beliefs or the ideas that you have, and everything else is carried and supported by this mental frame. It will affect your actions, as we will see. And so your worldview even shapes the simplest thoughts that you have, those simple thoughts that pop into your head when you're doing something as normal or as menial as just walking through that grocery store. It's constantly filtering out all those experiences, and it assists you in navigating the world around you. So, as a mental frame, your worldview supports everything that you think and believe about the world, the universe, human purpose, and that means collectively the purpose of all humanity, but then also individually your purpose, other people's purposes. So that worldview influences, it helps you think about the universe, human purpose, human responsibility, again, collectively and individually. Helps you think about things like social norms or laws, God, morality, the afterlife, justice, love, hate, beauty, and all of these different things. It's all filtered through that worldview that you've been developing since you were a child. The core or the set of beliefs that it's the core of the set of beliefs that allows you and even causes you to act in the physical world. And we'll see, again, it's not just about the mental aspect, because that mental aspect controls your actions, it controls your physical aspect, it controls your behavior as well. So for example, when it comes to controlling your behavior, for example, if you believe that much of the responsibility falls on a society to care for each of its members. If your basic understanding of society is that it should care for each of its members, as opposed to, for example, you might believe that it's up to each individual to take care of themselves and it's not up to the society to care for the members. So those two opposing beliefs, right? How much you think or agree with one position, it's up to the society, it's up to the person, might influence something like how you vote in an election. So if you believe, for example, that it really just is kind of on the society and you've got a politician over here who believes that same thing, you're more likely to vote for that person. And so your belief, that underlying worldview, the things that you think and all the filters that your ideas go through, affected the way that you voted in that election. Now, on the other hand, if you believe, for example, whether you agree with abortion or you disagree with abortion, let's say that politician over here that you agreed with when it comes to social responsibility, let's say that you have the opposite belief of that politician when it comes to abortion. You might not be able to vote for that politician on the grounds of he believes what you believe about social responsibility, because maybe you disagree with him completely on the issue of abortion. And for you, if abortion is a more important or a more valuable idea or more important right to you, then you might vote for the opposing candidate because your ideas on abortion line up with that candidate. And so what happens, what we see here, is that your ideas play out in your actions in that of your voting for one candidate versus another. And then that also has introduced to us a very important part of our worldview, and that is the idea of value. Because remember, I said that, if you value your opinion on abortion more than you value your opinion on the responsibility of whose responsibility it is to take care of the members of society, that value is going to elevate the issue of abortion, and so you're going to vote for the politician that you agree with. And so worldview isn't just simply this idea of we throw all the ideas into a pot and it kind of stews together and whatever we get, we get. It doesn't work that way. Instead, we have something else that elevates it, adds weight to one issue versus another. And again, this is part of the reason that humans are so complex. So this idea here comes from judging value, right? And so just a kind of another idea that kind of comes with this is that imagine that you are somebody who believes in a religion and that holds value for you. And it might be something then that you would spend what I call your resources on, and resources are just time, energy, and money. So it might be that if you believe in a religion, you're going to spend your resources on some type of religious activity. On the other hand, if you don't believe in any kind of religion, then you're probably not going to spend your resources on any type of religious activity because it holds no value for you. And so there's that added depth of complexity within just exactly what is a worldview when we add in this idea of some things being more valuable than others. Now, what you believe determines what you value, and what you value determines how you behave. So what you believe determines what you value, and what you value determines how you behave. Very important sentence there. Just kind of an example of seeing that idea work out. I had a student in one of my classes who made this statement, all anyone cares about is money. And he said that that was true of people even if they didn't know that it was true for them, and even if they didn't believe it was true of them, it was still true for them. All anybody cares about, he said, was money. Now, none of my students in the class agreed with that statement, and he was very, very firm in his belief, so I didn't spend a lot of time trying to dissuade him from his position. I just let it go and we moved on with the class. But as that example here, if that's true for him, if that's his belief with regard to his worldview, then what he thinks is valuable is money, and all of his actions will follow that most basic, most important norm or rule for him, is that all anybody cares about is money. So his actions, all of his resources are going to be spent on trying to go out and acquire more money. That's what his life is going to revolve around. That's how it works. What you believe determines what you value. What you value determines how you behave. That's the way humans work. So I asked you to note that some influences are internal and others are external, and that's going to lead us to the next piece of this podcast, which just is the idea of nature versus nurture. Now, I expect that a very large number of you are familiar with the discussion of nature versus nurture, so I'm not going to go deeply into it. But in a nutshell, just in case someone doesn't know, the question in psychology is which is more influential in a child and eventually in an adult's development. Is it their nature or their nurture? Now, nature just means that this is what we are naturally, or we are naturally, a person might be naturally kind or cruel, they might be naturally impulsive, they might be easygoing, or they might be driven. Some people, for better or worse, will defy their nature and act differently that is natural for them. But the question here is, what is a person like just by nature? It just is internal. It really is who they are. It's just kind of easy to say. It's just that they were born that way. Okay, so that's nature. Nurture just means how has a person been shaped by the different external influences in their lives. So were they taught to be selfless and play well with others? Were they taught to obey the rules? And did that teaching influence who they became? And so nurture comes from the external influences, and it includes things like we listed earlier, but parents, siblings, school, even the kind of community that you were raised in. It could be city versus rural. What media you consume, or even something like having had the opportunity to travel can really influence a person in a nurturing way. So when it comes to what kind of person someone has become, which is more influential in this case? Is it nature or is it nurture? And so when it comes to nature versus nurture, as far as I'm concerned, and I don't like to give my opinion completely all the time, but in this case, what I'm just going to say is I think it's generally a wash. And what I mean is that it's pretty much equal when it comes to influencing who a person is, both coming from the outside and from the inside. And I think that's not true for everyone, but I think it's basically true for the majority of people. And that's also not to say that it's a perfect 50-50 split within all people. I don't think that's necessarily the case either. But I think it will affect people kind of equally in a sense of that both are important. And so I don't think we could say it's versus, I think it's more inclusive. It's both nature and nurture. Now, mostly what I want is for us to realize that two things are battling inside of us, and that we're trying to harmonize both of these things within us. We're trying to harmonize our basic nature, but then we're also trying to harmonize those external influencers and trying to use those nurturing experiences or nurturing lessons that we've learned as well. I guess just kind of as a quick example here, using myself, I can imagine that if I had been raised by different parents, or if my parents had been different people, that I would be a very different person as well. I can see a couple of turning points in my parents' lives that took them in the direction that they went. And if they hadn't had those turning points, if different decisions would have been made, I think they would have been very different, and therefore I would have been very different. So let me just say that by nature, I am not an evil, I'm not a malevolent type person. I have some darker desires, which I think most people do. But then most people understand, as I understand them, I want to live a virtuous life that is pretty consistent and normal as most people understand it. However, having studied personalities, I understand that I see life as a strategy game, and I could easily have developed into someone who acts as if others were pieces on a chessboard. I could easily walk through life using people to my benefit and see them as nothing more than a means to an end. That's really part of my nature. And if it was not for my nurturing parents who instilled in me a sense of value for each and every person simply because they are human, I could easily have been different. So inside me, I can see that potential for being highly manipulative, but I could see me using as people as pawns, but I don't. And in a big part, that is due to the nurturing capacity that my parents played in my life. Now, I expect that if you sat down and thought long enough, you could come up with some examples of your nature that make you a better or worse person versus the nurture that would make you a better or worse person, just like I just shared. And when I peer into my own mind, I understand that I am my own person, but I also acknowledge that I am the product of my upbringing. So again, I think it's a wash. I think it's a both and. So nature and nurture is part of our worldview. It's part of our understanding of worldviews that helps us to understand ourselves better. But hopefully, also, you'll take some of these things, not just seeing yourself better, but seeing other people and understanding them better as well, especially those who are different than you or who think differently than you do. After all, people have different natures, but then people also have been nurtured differently as well. So, another important thing for us to think about and to understand with worldviews is that all the different pieces interact with each other. And so, what I like to say is that people are not waffles, we are plates of spaghetti. Now, what I mean by that is that we can't compartmentalize our lives into neat little squares like waffles. Squares where all the syrup is kept separate and it doesn't touch the other syrup inside the other squares. Humans don't work like that. We are messy plates of spaghetti. And so all of the noodles in that plate of spaghetti, all of the different ideas, all the different experiences that make up a human, all those different influences, thoughts, and actions, all those noodles touch each other and at different places and at different times. And so sometimes if we're trying to trace our thinking or our actions back to a source, it can be very messy, it can be very complex trying to trace a single noodle through all the piles of spaghetti because all of those noodles are influencing all the other noodles in its path. So our thinking is generally not neat like a waffle, but it is messy like a plate of spaghetti. And so when it comes to a worldview, we can't ignore or compartmentalize one noodle while we're trying to deal with other noodles. All we can do is decide which noodle or noodles are more important or more valuable. There's that word value again, more valuable than others. And because some of them have more value, they carry more weight when we're making decisions. But each piece or each noodle of the worldview will affect the other pieces of that worldview. Now, for example, here, the kind of the effect of why this is important and how it works. When I was a kid, I remember hearing the phrase, the statement, keep your religion and your politics separate. Now, once you understand how a worldview works, you realize that that's impossible. You can't wall off one part of your ideas and keep it away from other parts. We don't work like that. Now, another phrase I heard pretty often was, don't bring your family problems to work. And honestly, it would be lovely if we could keep our family problems at home and our work problems, at work. Keep our work problems away from our family. But we don't work that way. Humans don't function like that. We are messy plates of spaghetti. And so all the different noodles are going to touch. So it's easy to see how a worldview affects the big ideas and the big choices that we make, but it also affects our most seemingly mundane or arbitrary choices as well. So for example, imagine two people doing something as ordinary as buying a pair of shoes. It's true that they will be looking for something that they like, but what goes into liking is more complex than just merely taste. So put quickly here, a Kardashian is going to look at a shoe very differently than a middle-class mother. Both of them might be looking at things like expense or fashion or comfort, but they're going to be looking at those things very, very differently. A Kardashian may look at the shoe and only care about style, where the middle-class mother might consider style, but would also consider something like expense and comfort. And so they're going to look at this something very simple as buying a pair of shoes. These two women could look at that experience very, very differently. They're not going to see the world the same way, and that means they're not going to make the same choices in shoes because of it. But now imagine that they're doing something more important, like having a conversation about abortion. And let's say both of them are passionate about the topic. They have opinions, right, that are very important to their worldview. these two individuals might have very, very different opinions on the topic of abortion simply because, again, their experiences have been so different that it's likely that their understanding and their thoughts on abortion will also be quite different just because of their different backgrounds. So that's really kind of how all of these things start to work out. So, what we believe affects what we value, and what we value affects our actions. So, what if we have bad beliefs? Well, logically, if we have bad beliefs, we will have bad values, and therefore we will have bad actions. So, if belief determines value and value determines actions, if you start at the bottom and you have bad beliefs, then bad values, and therefore bad actions. Now, an easy kind of example that is probably overused, but I'm going to use it here again because it's easy. The Nazis did not value humans because they believe, I'm sorry, the Nazis didn't value Jews as humans because they didn't believe that the Jews were human, or at least they weren't fully human. And so they didn't have to value them in the same way they valued humans, which means they did not have to behave humanely towards them. They could torture them, they could kill them in the millions because they didn't value them as humans. And what they believed that Jews were not fully human, and therefore they didn't value them, therefore they could behave badly towards the Jews. And that's the way this idea of your ideas determines what you value, your value determines how you behave. So that kind of insight that into a worldview, that can help us understand somebody like the Nazis, but it can also help us to understand a less extreme example. So if you see someone doing something that you don't understand, or maybe they're doing something that you disagree with, or even something that you might consider to be stupid, it might be because they have a different core belief or worldview than you have. That person has a reason for doing what they're doing. And notice that I didn't say they had a good reason for doing what they were doing. Notice I didn't even say they understood the reason behind why they were doing what they're doing. They simply have different beliefs than you, and they have different values than you. Therefore, they're going to act differently than you. But if you try to understand their beliefs, you may begin to understand their values and therefore understand their actions. Now, it's important here to note that you're not obligated to agree with their beliefs or support their actions once you understand them. You may come to understand them and conclude that they are wrong. However, the world would be a kinder place if we all strived to understand each other before we condemned each other. Now, another reason it's important for us to understand our worldview and where it comes from is we can accommodate change. So as you go through life, you will have more and more experiences, you'll gain more and more knowledge, and this means that there is a real possibility that at least one of your core beliefs will change. So moving away from the analogy of the frame of a building, think now of your worldview as a puzzle and each of your different beliefs or ideas as a piece of that puzzle. So for example, just to kind of help you see how this is going to work with a puzzle analogy. Let's suppose that you're a trusting person and one of your core beliefs is that those that you love and who love you, that they can be trusted. But then one of those loved ones violates your trust in some extraordinary way. That piece of your worldview puzzle might be broken or it might be changed in some significant way because of your experience. And then your belief has to change as well. So if that happens to you, if one of your puzzles gets broken, pieces of your puzzle gets broken or changed, what's going to have to happen is that the rest of the puzzle is going to have to change in order for that piece to fit back into the puzzle. Or if that piece is eliminated altogether, then again, the puzzle is going to have to remake itself so that it fits together again based on the disappearance of that piece of the puzzle. So kind of that idea of changing or disappearing, for example, life tragedy is one of the easier ways to kind of explain why the pieces might change or disappear or be broken, right? So for example, the loss of a loved one has caused many people to stop believing in God. In fact, one of my professors in college had exactly this experience where his wife died and he stopped believing in God, which means that a significant piece of his worldview puzzle was taken out, and it took time for all of those pieces then to come and to fit back together, because they all have to adjust in order to accommodate the change of that piece. And just also to kind of offset this idea of bad things affecting the puzzle, your worldview puzzle, good things can also introduce or take out or change pieces as well. So, for an example, from my own life, I remember when I think I was 10, 11, 12, I was somewhere in there. I can't remember the exact date. Christmas morning was always really, really significant to our family. It was a very magical time. Our parents really strived to make sure that we had that magical Christmas. And I remember that year when I was 10, 11, 12, somewhere in there. I remember the experience, apparently, not the year. Somewhere in there, I recall that I got a 22 rifle for Christmas. That was the first gun that I owned. I was brought up with guns, but I didn't own one. So this was my first gun. And I remember sitting there holding my gun, and I remember thinking to myself that something was very different this year. And it was troubling me. And so my dad noticed that my distress, I suppose. And he looked at me and asked what was wrong. And I told him I wasn't sure, but I felt like something was missing. And he told me about how, as we age, the magic of Christmas can diminish, and then, eventually we lose that magic as well. And it's this idea of growing up. And in that moment, I began to realize that that was part of my experience, that I was, in fact, growing up. Now, part of me was really, really sad because I understood that that magic of Christmas was going to disappear and it wasn't going to come back. And so part of me was mourning for the loss of that magic. And quite frankly, part of me still mourns for the loss of that magic as well. But another part of me was really, really excited because I was entering this phase of growing up. And the gun, in that case, was a symbol of that I was beginning that process. And it was also a symbol in that my parents had faith in me, that I would behave responsibly and that I would continue to grow and mature. And that gun was just a symbol of that faith. And so a piece of the puzzle was taken, maybe the magic of Christmas, the loss of innocence, whatever you want to call it. But another piece was added in that I was becoming a grown-up and that I was beginning to accept responsibility and take that seriously. So there's this idea within your worldview of give and take. You take pieces, you add them, you take pieces out, they change, they break, they disappear. It's all part of this craziness that just is the thing that we try to do on this daily basis, which is, again, trying to harmonize ourselves and then trying to harmonize ourselves with others. Reshaping a worldview takes time, and it can be very frightening. So once your worldview is formed, you feel very comfortable. Mentally, things function smoothly. You know how to process experiences as you're having them, both big and small, and you can fit them into their proper place. But then when your worldview changes, for better or for worse, it will cause a ripple effect that touches the other pieces of your worldview. And so whether a worldview is changing for the good or for bad, it's going to take time for that worldview to put itself together again, for the puzzle to make sense, the pieces to fit, and the picture to look right. Again, it's going to take time. So can you see now why it's so hard to harmonize ourselves? There are so many influences, both internal and external, And we have to sort through them and compare them to past influences, see how they fit, decide about value, which is more value and therefore it has more weight. And then we have to figure out how to act according to that worldview, to the puzzle as we put it together. Not only that, but we also need to be able to see this process in other people as well in order to at least try to begin to understand them. Now, remember that phrase I used earlier, there's a lot of moving parts. That's true for our worldview, but going back to the puzzle analogy, imagine trying to put together a puzzle that keeps changing. Let's say the picture on the surface keeps changing, and even the pieces keep changing shape as well. So when we're trying to put this puzzle together, the picture changes and the pieces change shape. They keep shuffling around. So putting it together, putting that worldview together, is going to be an ongoing task as you keep trying to shape that worldview. It's not something that's necessarily going to stop. Now, as I said, when you're younger, you're doing a lot more construction. As you age, you have the basic framework kind of laid out. It can change, but there's not nearly as much construction as we begin to and continue to age. But it is inevitable that our worldview will change as we age, because again, life constantly changes and we constantly change. So for those of you who are older, and I'll let you decide what older is, think back to your teen years and think about whether or not you're the same now as you were then, and you're not. And so if you're old enough, now think about yourself like in your 20s. You're not the same person you were as a teenager. And if you're old enough now, think about yourself in your 30s. You're not the same person you were in your 20s. Now think about yourself in the 40s, and you get the idea. You see the pattern as it kind of lays itself out there. And decades are very nice little divider lines. They're not perfect, but they're kind of nice. You know, they kind of give us a general idea of where we're going to be in our growth and development as we move through life. But you're going to continue to change as you continue to age. And so your interests, your ideas, your ideals, beliefs, goals, your personality, your outlook, all of those things are going to change as you move from, let's say, like something like a college student to a parent to a grandparent. All of those things are very, very different phases in life, and you're understanding the world around you. Your worldview is going to change as you're going through those different pieces, those different phases of your life. Now, in psychology, there is something called end of history illusion. And basically, what that means is that people tend to believe that they have experienced significant personal growth in their lives, but they don't believe that they will change significantly in the future. Somehow, they tend to think of themselves as done changing. That is to say, they might say something like, yes, I changed significantly in my 30s, but now, I'm set because I'm in my 40s. And then later on, they get to their 50s and they might acknowledge, yeah, I changed significantly in my 40s, but now I'm in my 50s and I'm set, right? And that pattern tends to continue again with that human experience. But humans don't work that way. And quite frankly, we shouldn't work that way. The reality is that we change as we move through life, and we need to. We need to change. We can't stay there in that teenage mentality or even the 20-year-old mentality throughout our life and throughout our career. You're going to change, and you should. It's beneficial. It's helpful for you to do that. But what that means is that your worldview is going to change as well. So you need to be prepared to understand that the incoming knowledge, the incoming experiences, all of those things are going to change you as you continue through life. Now, that's scary in a lot of ways because basically humans don't really like change. We're pattern-seeking and following creatures. So change can be scary. But if you kind of open your mind to the fact that it's also an opportunity for growth. Imagine that you got stuck there in your teen decades. Imagine all the growth that you would never have experienced because you were stuck in that decade. And the same will be true for your 20s, 30s, 40s, all the way up. So, yeah, it's scary because there's going to be change, but there is an opportunity for growth if you get your mind set in the right way. It can be something that really will help you. So, it can be scary. On the other hand, it's an opportunity for growth. Both of those things are very, very difficult, but what would you expect? After all, it is hard to be human. Now, if you found any value in this podcast, please like it and share, and I will see you next time.